Hello everyone. Welcome to our Agile Quadrants webinar series. My name is Christine and I'll be your moderator. Today's webinar will be led by LogiGear's co-founder, Michael Hackett. Before we begin, let me cover a few housekeeping items. First, this webinar will last about 45 minutes. We will not have a Q&A today. Instead, please DM any questions you have and we'll follow up with them after the webinar. This webinar will be recorded and distributed within 48 hours. Part 1 covered what the Agile Testing Quadrants are and how they fit in modern SDLCs. In today's webinar, Michael will focus on a walkthrough of the quadrants, issues with the quadrants, ownership, and what teams can do with this information and closing thoughts. Now, let me introduce Michael and LogiGear. LogiGear is a leading provider of enterprise software testing solutions and test automation tools. Michael Hackett is a co-founder of LogiGear. His training courses have brought Silicon Valley testing expertise to over 16 countries. In addition to his software engineering work, Michael's provided training for Salesforce, Fidelity, Intuit, Adobe, Bank of America, and many other software producers. Michael has 2 decades of experience with software engineering, quality assurance, and testing of various applications. Michael is a certified Scrum Master and holds a Bachelor of Science degree in Engineering from Carnegie Mellon University. With that being said, I'm going to hand it over to Michael. Take it away, Michael.
Hi, everybody. This is part 2 of the Agile Quadrants video on building an Agile testing strategy. In part 1, that hopefully you've already viewed, we talked about traditional SDLC and software development lifecycle and how we got here with Agile and Scrum and extreme programming. Leads us to part 2 of this video is getting into low-level details about the Agile Quadrants and how we're going to build an Agile testing strategy out of it. Most people, when they talk about the quadrants, they go right into the low-level details and what are the tasks you do in quadrant 1, what are the tasks you do in quadrant 2, and I think that's a mistake. When Brian Merrick first developed this, he came up with this quadrant paradigm, but the outside axes, the outside sides of the rectangle were labeled that are really going to help us build a unique strategy for how we develop the products we work on, our individual products, for how you can develop. You have this information for how you can develop the best strategy. So down on this lower axis, we have technology-facing tests. Quadrant 1 and Quadrant 4 are going to be technical tests. Quadrant 1 and Quadrant 2 support programming, support writing better code, support programmers. Quadrant 2 and Quadrant 3 are business-facing tests. And Quadrant 3 and Quadrant 4 critique the product. So what is Quadrant 1? Quadrant 1 is technology tests that support programming. The tests that we do in here, I'll tell you, the Quadrant 1 is the easiest to talk about. Unit testing or component testing, very low-level testing. Unit testing is technical testing that supports programmers, right? I could write a couple of unit tests. I could write some code. If I'm doing TDD, I'd write the test first, I'd write some unit tests, and then write the code to make those unit tests pass. They're low-level technical tests that are supporting me as a programmer to write better code, to deliver better code. So that's Quadrant 1. Quadrant 2 are business-facing tests that are also supporting the programming, are also supporting writing better code. Quadrant 3 are business-facing tests that critique the product. So business level, user style tests that are going to critique the product. For example, usability testing is in Quadrant 3. Normally, usability testing is typically in Quadrant 3. So these are business-facing tests, right? Usability tests that are going to critique how usable is it. And then Quadrant 4 are technology tests that critique the product. So they're technology tests that critique the product. For example, performance tests typically show up in Quadrant 4, so they're technology tests, right? Performance tests are technical tests that critique the product. So why do I say this is more important than understanding the individual low-level tasks? The individual tasks that show up in Quadrant 1, Quadrant 2, Quadrant 3, Quadrant 4 are really going to depend on your product and how your team works and even where your team is located and what happens inside a sprint and outside a sprint, all those things that we're going to talk about. But understanding how you're going to build your own strategy. When I say quadrant one is technology-facing tests, they're technical tests that are going to help you deliver better code. They're going to support programming. Quadrant three are business-facing tests. They're very different tests, right? The low-level technical tests are very different than the business-facing tests, done by different people at a different time. So this is where understanding the big box and then seeing how things fit into these other boxes, how they fit into quadrant one and quadrant two, how they fit into these other boxes. You're going to have to be making those decisions for your own agile testing strategy. Is why I think that understanding how Brian Merrick built this idea is important. So now, having said that, let's look at these two sides. I want to contrast what happens in quadrant one and quadrant two versus what happens in quadrant three and quadrant four for a minute to understand these things better at a higher level. Quadrant one and two, they support programming, they support the code, they support programmers. It's going to guide development. Issues that you find, bugs that you find, tests that you run during quadrant one and quadrant two could change development. It's going to guide development. You're going to make better code. Right? It's checking and validating. If I have individual acceptance criteria, let's say I'm going to use an example like we're making a zip code search. We're making a postal code search that's only going to work in the U.S. So I say I have an acceptance criteria that says a postal code is 5 digits. I can check that a 5-digit postal code is going to work. If a 5-digit postal code doesn't work, we have to fix that code. It's going to be pretty low level. The individual isolated function isn't working. So that checking and validating that the acceptance criteria work the way we want them to work. It's also preventing bugs. If we're doing this, if I'm a developer and I'm doing this at the code level and I'm running a whole bunch of tests myself, I'm preventing bugs from getting out into even the later test environments. I'm preventing bugs from even getting out into user acceptance testing because they're a whole lot cheaper, a whole lot faster for me to fix when I'm doing them myself inside quadrant one and quadrant two. They tend to be pretty low level tests, and some of it's white box. It's not all white box. Depending on your product, right, the context of your product. Some of these could be done through a UI, and they could be black box tests. But it's a bunch of white box tests, a bunch of low level tests. Different than what happens in quadrant three and quadrant four, where we're critiquing the product as a whole. It's a whole product, and we're critiquing the product as a whole. It's customer type tests. Workflows, feature level tests, as opposed to if quadrant one and quadrant two are functional tests, we might get into some feature, some task driven tests in quadrant two, but quadrant three and quadrant four are very much transaction, workflow, scenario, task, feature level tests. They're probably UI driven at this point because we have a UI. The product is pretty much built by the time you get to quadrant three. These are tasks that are typically done through a UI. It's testing, and I have this testing in italics, meaning what if I try and search for a zip code that's a valid zip code, but it has no results? What if I try and search for a zip code that's a valid zip code that has a lot of results? What if I search for a zip code that is a 5-digit zip code, but it's not a valid zip code? What if it's in the right syntax, but it's not a valid zip code? What if I search for 5 alpha characters or 6 alpha characters? Or what if I search for a zip plus 4? That what if kind of testing in italics, the types of tests that traditional testers run. Now that I've got this product and it's put together and it functions, we can do a zip code search for a 5-digit zip code. Where do you do the tester type tests? The types of tests that traditional testers would run, where do they happen? They typically happen in quadrant 3 and quadrant 4. Quadrant 3 and quadrant 4 is also about discovering, exploring. When we talk about exploratory testing is going to show up in quadrant 3. I don't always agree with that. I think we should do exploratory testing as early as we can. Listen, if you can do exploratory testing at the unit level, let's say I'm doing pair programming and I have a buddy who's also a developer and she's going to run a bunch of unit tests. She could be doing some BDD. She could be doing some low-level tests against my code, exploring, right? Maybe she does some data-driven tests where I write a unit test and she just plugs in a bunch of different data to do exploratory testing as early as possible. Even some of those what-if tests I came up with for the zip code search, if I wrote a little function that could plug those in way behind the UI, we could find exploratory bugs as early as possible. So I'm not going to confine exploratory testing to quadrant 3 like some people do. I think we need to do exploratory testing as early as possible. But the idea of exploring, discovering, learning more about how the product as a whole works, more like what the customer experience is going to be. Remember, these are quadrant 3 is business focus tests. Exploring and discovering how it works is on the quadrant 3, quadrant 4 side. If quadrant 1 and quadrant 2 is preventing bugs from being released out into the system, quadrant 3 and quadrant 4 is bug finding, finding the bugs the way testers find bugs, the more like transaction workflow type testing than code level preventing bugs from checking that the individual function we wrote is going to work the way we think it's going to work. Over on the quadrant 1, quadrant 2 side, on the quadrant 3, quadrant 4 side, we're finding bugs, thinking about looking for gaps. What didn't we think about? What are some other workflows? What if I try it with 5 different pieces of data? That kind of tester type testing. It's why I have that tester type testing in italics. Doing the tester thing, right? Doing the tester thing typically happens out in quadrant 3 and quadrant 4, and it's typically black box because I have a UI at this point, right? And my customers are going to get the product. No, I didn't say GUI, right? I said UI. Whatever your final UI. If you write an API, you write a service, and that's what you do. The API could be a black box to the people who are testing it out in quadrant 3, quadrant 4. So, one thing about quadrants being quadrants and quadrants not being a traditional flow that was linear. In part 1 of the video, I showed this flow that was a linear flow. Part of quadrants could be that I'm doing some, if performance tests typically show up in quadrant 4, I could be doing performance testing as early as possible, as early as I can. The thing about quadrants is they're not linear. Right? I could be doing exploratory tests as early as I could. If I have a UI really early, maybe I should be doing a bunch of UI-driven tests in quadrant 2. It's why understanding what the goal of the 4 quadrants is the key part, and then you designing an agile strategy for yourself is your part. Taking these ideas and applying them for yourself. So let's take a look at the agile quadrants that are probably the most famous diagram, the one that most people reference. This is the one that Brian Marek wrote the skeleton of that wound up being published in the Agile Testing book. And this comes right from, I have a link to a blog. If you don't have this book, you may want to really go dive into it to understand what this is about. But this comes from Lisa Crispin's blog using the Agile Testing Quadrants. So again, we have these technology-facing tests, supporting the team, business-facing tests, critiquing the product, quadrant 1, 2, 3, 4. Great. So quadrant 1, easiest to understand, unit testing, component testing, we got that. They're technology-facing tests that support the team, support the product, write better code. Quadrant 2, business-facing tests, functional tests. Does that zip code function work? If I have an error case, I'm going to have an error message for if it's more than 6 characters or whatever I'm going to do with more than 6 characters. That function, I can check that function works according to the user story. Examples: story level tests, story level acceptance criteria tests, prototypes and simulators. You want to do prototypes and simulator tests as soon as you can. You don't have to wait until you may have a couple of units done and be able to do a prototype test, a couple of chunks of code done, and be able to do a test a simulator maybe. If you want to do them as soon as you can. The bigger idea to look at here is functional tests, examples, story level tests. We're doing user story, if you're using user stories, requirement level, user story level, acceptance criteria level, tests are pretty small, isolated tests. One thing that we're going to get into a bit later is which of these quadrants happen inside a sprint or outside of a sprint or after a sprint, or do you build up technical debt, or do you just say we're going to do that task later, or the story's not done? We're going to have that conversation in a couple of minutes. But some teams do quadrant 1 and quadrant 2 inside the story, inside the sprint. And quadrant 1 and quadrant 2 is done, and we can call the story. And quadrant 3 and quadrant 4 happens after on a more integrated product. Now, I'm not telling you that that's what you should do, but because that's going to be left up to the context of how you do your development and how you have environments. But quadrant 1 and quadrant 2 are small, low-level tests, individual functions, acceptance criteria level that are going to help us at the coding level make a better product. The individual functions we're writing work, and we even if we're getting into our story has business-facing tests. Quadrant 3, exploratory. I mentioned a little bit on the slide ago that sometimes people call quadrant 3 the exploratory phase. That irks me a little bit because I think we want to do exploratory testing as early as we can. It doesn't have to be confined to later, even maybe before a story is demoed, right? Before, we can have a story and say it's done. Some people, when they demo, the PO, the product owner, will go and run the demo themselves according to what the user story is, and they're very likely to explore. They're very likely to try a couple of different things. We don't want them to run into bugs and have a story fail because we didn't do any exploratory testing, right? So exploratory tests, one of the reasons why I think exploratory tests fall under quadrant 3 as it was published in the book is because most people do exploratory testing from a UI level that is more like this function talking to that function, talking to the next function, talking to the next function. I do function 1, then function 2, then function 3, then go back and edit the data from function 2, then go do function 3, then go back and edit the data from function 2, then do function 4 and 5 and 6. Or when I do exploratory tests, I could try it on one browser, try it on another browser. Try it in one character set, try it on another character set. Having the time to do all those varieties of tests and the environments and the product that it's built enough for me to test through a UI where it's going to be a lot easier and faster to run those tests might not happen until the whole product is built, which is probably more like quadrant 3, where the story, individual story level tests happen in quadrant 2, story tests are done, we move on to a more integrated product level. So exploratory testing, quadrant 3. Scenarios like transaction. Scenario meaning multiple sequence of events. Scenario means a sequence of events. Function 1, then function 2, then function 3, then edit function 2, then 3, 4, 5. Right? So bigger, whether you call them workflows or transactions or end-to-ends or tasks, whatever your team calls them, scenarios that are bigger, longer tests. Now this, when we get into this idea of, in a couple of slides, of this quadrant thing, do you do all 4 quadrants before you can call a story done? Let's stop right here at scenario tests for part of this discussion. If I have a workflow that goes, function 1, then function 2, then function 3, edit function 2, then function 4, 5, 6, right? When am I going to have all of those functions done? If my story, let's say I work on function 2, the zip code search is my function and that's my function, but it goes into a whole sequence. It's going to be a whole transaction that other teams own some of those features. Other teams are still working on them. They are doing their own thing with getting their own stories done. when can I do that scenario test? If I say something, if I have my story and I have my acceptance criteria and I get that done inside my sprint, I get that done inside quadrant 2. If that whole task has to work together for me to say that, okay, this product, this value, this we're going to deliver these couple of functions together out to our customers, this what workflow they now have this workflow to use. Can I call my story done when I just have my function 2 done? They may very well, when someone does that workflow of testing function 1, then function 2, then function 3, 4, 5, 6, when someone runs those tests, they may very well find bugs against my user story, against my function. What are we going to do with that? My story was closed. It's done. Do I have technical debt? Am I just going to fix it? Is the story kind of done? Is it? That's a whole nother conversation of having doing Scrum with kind of done stories. I'm not one of those people who believe that you have to do quadrant 1, 2, 3, 4 to call a story done. We'll finish that conversation in a couple of slides. Okay, so quadrant 3, exploratory tests, scenarios, usability tests, right? Usability, what's usability? Usability is ease of use, right? How easy is it to use? Do I have to keep my hand on the keyboard the whole time, or am I going to go out to a mouse, or how do I, if I have a mobile device, how usable is this function? Business-facing tests that are going to critique the product. User acceptance tests. So this is where you would get into doing a beta or a public beta, letting a customer access the system, pre-release customer testing in that traditional workflow, user acceptance testing, right? An expensive place to find bugs, but we need to see how happy the user is going to be with this. If I deliver this product as it is, are the customers really going to find value in this? And then quadrant 4, performance testing, load testing, security testing, ability testing like accessibility testing, whatever kinds of other finished product testing you do that are more technical facing tests that are going to critique the product is quadrant 4. So that is a low-level detail description of the quadrants, the way that they were written, this example set in the Agile testing book. So to have a couple of conversations about that, one of the goals here is to figure out who's going to do what, whether you call it roles and responsibilities, who's going to do what. So when it comes to that tester testing, where do you do your tester testing? Do you do it in quadrant 2, inside a story, inside a Scrum team? Do you do transaction workflow end-to-end tests, user acceptance tests later on in quadrant 3 and quadrant 4? Who does those quadrant 3 and quadrant 4 tasks? When do they happen? But also to ask this question of where your team finds bugs. So where does your team find bugs now? Let me tell you a story. So there's this one client that I was working with, and before I was working with them, I was talking to the manager, and she and I are having these couple of conversations. And I said to her, she managed a whole product that was a variety of Scrum teams that worked in a variety of places, and each team had their own separate individual tasks functionality that they owned. And I said to her, where do you find bugs? Where does your team find bugs? Do they find bugs in individual functions? Do they find bugs in individual stories? Or do they find most of the bugs in integration testing? Do you find bugs in user acceptance testing? Where do you find bugs? And she laughed and she said, we find no bugs in the individual functions. We find no bugs in, once, let's say we get it into an integrated environment and the whole product is present, what we used to call system testing. She said, we don't find individual functional bugs. People do their stories and they do a great job. We find 100% of our bugs in integration testing. And okay, so maybe 1 or 2 of those might be individual functional bugs, but it's when one function integrates with another function, that's where problems happen. When one function is supposed to write something out to this database and write something out to, send a message to something else and then go on and pass data to the next function. It's the integration of how these systems all work together and on the environment that's similar to the production environment or on the production environment. It's when the whole thing gets integrated, that's where they find their bugs. So I showed her this quadrant thing, and she said, all we'd wind up doing is quadrant 3 testing, because that's where we find all of our bugs. Now, I'm not going to go through in this short video how we solve that problem, but I think that's a valid and common problem that she has. Is the teams work on their individual stories and they seem to be okay. It's when they get to the bigger integrated product, this doing workflows and transactions, that's when they would get to things that they didn't think of yet. Oh gosh, this is a gap. The user story didn't even cover that thing. This is where they found most of their bugs. So part of coming up with your strategy is, where are you finding your bugs, right? And if devs did more testing, if developers are taking on more tests, if they're doing more unit tests, maybe they're even doing some individual functional tests, bugs that we're talking about, of where do you find your bugs? If we found those, we're currently finding them in quadrant 3. If developers took on more testing, could you find those bugs in quadrant 1? Would they even know to run those kind of tests or to look for those kind of gaps? Would people who are doing individual story level tests find those bigger integration tests? Would they know enough about how customers use the product when they're testing the individual story to find gaps, to find things that are missing? So part of coming up with this strategy is that the tester testing kind of thing. Who's doing the fully integrated product and end-to-end transaction type things? Where does your team find bugs now? And using this quadrant paradigm, what quadrant would they be found in, and could they be shifted earlier? Could testing tasks be shifted earlier so that you could find them earlier, find the bugs earlier when they're cheaper to fix? And if your devs do take on more tasks early on in quadrant 1 and quadrant 2, would that really reduce the need for quadrant 3 and quadrant 4 testing? Would they be finding the kind of bugs that you would find in exploratory testing, end-to-end testing, system level testing, user acceptance testing? That's usually a difficult answer. So these tasks like integration testing, system testing, user acceptance, and scenario workflow transaction, things that you run on staging or pre-production platform type tests, browser type tests, device tests, how are these going to fit in how do they fit into your current testing strategy, and where can we put them in these quadrants so that the bugs get found earlier, and they're done by the right people? And also, one of the other issues you have to solve is, what about our automation strategy? Where are we going to automate? Developers doing their own, automating their own unit tests, but where are we going to automate service level API tests? Where are we going to do UI automation? How much automation is going to be UI driven? These are all conversations that have to be part of our testing strategy. So there's other types of tests, right? Like memory tests, like concurrency tests, locale settings, testing in different character sets, forced error tests, like error guessing, things that are probably not even covered in the user story. Who does those types of tests? They have to fit into your testing strategy somewhere. And then the non-functional tests. We talked about load and performance in quadrant 4, usability in quadrant 3. Security testing is a very hot topic these days. Security testing is a very hot topic these days. The quadrants kind of don't really talk about it. It kind of talks about Q4, but I'm thinking of a customer that I have that they can't even check code in unless it runs through a security test. So they do security testing in every quadrant. They do security testing in quadrant 1, quadrant 2, quadrant 3, and quadrant 4. How is security testing going to fit into your Agile testing strategy? And then something like accessibility testing. If you have 508, like Americans with Disability Act, Section 508, sometimes people call it 508 testing. People are colorblind or have different input devices. Where do you do that kind of usability testing, that kind of accessibility testing that oftentimes has unique? You have to have knowledge of the law, the Section 508, unique tools, unique skill sets. Who and where is that testing going to happen? So all part of it's going to have to fall into your Agile strategy. So how are these things used? This idea that I brought up of do the 4 quadrants happen inside a sprint? How does it relate to your definition of done? Does it become technical debt? I brought up this idea of environments. It's very easy to see in the traditional workflow of having a dev environment, then a testing environment, then a staging environment, and the tests you run. A lot of teams will build their strategy over the environments they have. So who works on the dev environment, who does what on the testing environment, who does what on a staging environment before it goes to production. If you were going to be moving, for example, performance testing early or usability testing earlier, are you going to have an environment to run all of these tests? So let's say I have to get all my tests to call a story done. I have to do all my Q1, Q2, Q3, Q4 tests. Great. So if let's say I'm doing containers, where all I have to do is plug in my new container worth of code, and I have the whole entire product there and ready to test. I can do usability tests earlier. I could do performance tests. I can ship those tasks really early and get that done. Great. If I have cloud environments that I can really easily spin up infrastructure as code, and I can build these great environments really fast, and at any on-demand moment, I can get a whole environment that I can do accessibility testing really early inside my sprint. Sure, then maybe you can get all 4 quadrants of testing tasks done before you call a story done inside your sprint. But let's say I'm not doing containers, and I'm not doing cloud, where I can't, if I'm going to run a certain number of tests on various mobile devices, when are you going to have access to an environment that you can run those tests on each mobile device that you support, whether it's automated or manual? Kind of doesn't matter at this point. When are you going to have that available? In quadrant 3, in quadrant 2, when you're still working on the story? This is why it's context driven, and why you're going to have to be coming up with this agile strategy based on the context of how you develop, the environments you have available. So I actually prefer to. I have probably more clients who are using the quadrants who have no relation between quadrants and definition of done. That their quadrant 1 and quadrant 2 is inside a sprint, and they can call a story done when they've finished all their story level tests, and the quadrant 3 and quadrant 4 tests are outside of the idea of definition of done and the idea of a story done by different teams on other environments. I have a couple of clients who can't call a story done until it's gone through all quadrant 1, quadrant 2, quadrant 3, quadrant 4. So that's a difficult idea that you'll have to talk to your team about, deciding how are we going to do that? How are we going to handle whether we call something done or not? Because you're going to be finding bugs in quadrant 3 and quadrant 4. You're going to be finding bugs in quadrant 3, and the story's already done, and you know the issues. If you're doing Scrum already and measuring stories and having technical debt, you know the issues that can create. And then how you're going to apply automation. If we're saying that quadrant 3 is when I'm doing a lot more UI-driven tests because the whole product is complete and I have all my other functions there, I may not be doing any UI-driven automation until however much I do it, whether I'm trying to minimize how much UI automation I do, or most of my test automation strategy is UI automation, depending on you and your team and your skill level, or whatever the product needs are. You might not even start UI automation until quadrant 3 when the story's already done. So again, this building an automation strategy around these quadrants is an issue to solve. So if I want to look at one thing about this, who does what and when, I want to take a quick look at tester skill sets. A typical tester, test engineer, quality engineer, in the old days we used to call them QAs, right? Well, what are the skill sets that they have? Good testers have to have a knowledge of the user, have to understand what, if I'm working on an accounting application, I want some accountants testing it. If I'm working on a banking application, I want some bankers testing it. They know the users, they know how people know these systems. They have knowledge of the platform or the technology. If I'm working on iPads, how are iPads different than iPhones? How are they different than a desktop, like a Windows desktop application? How are they different? How does this technology work? What's unique about this technology? How are people going to be using it? And then separately, knowledge of testing and knowledge of quality. How do you write good test cases? What goes in a test case? How do you write good bugs? How do you write test plans if you're writing test plans? How do you come up with equivalence classes? How do you do data-driven testing? All these testing and quality practices are a separate skill set. So when it comes to who's going to be doing what tests in what quadrant, do your developers, do you have QEs? Are you going to have POs or business analysts? Who has knowledge of the user that can run business-facing tests, understands the user? Of course, everybody is supposed to understand the user when they're in, you can't deliver customer value if you don't know who the customer is, right? But in reality, I know a whole lot of developers, and I even know some QEs who don't really know their customers very well. So if I'm going to rely on someone who has knowledge of my customers to come up with customer transactions and workflows, who can come up with those tests when? Is it going to be my developers? Am I going to have QEs, quality engineers, test engineers who have that kind of knowledge of the user? Okay. Of course, POs, BAs, their main job is knowing the user. But a PM and a BO, a PO and a business analyst, a BA, PO and a BA, how much knowledge do they have of the platform and the technology? Maybe not that much. So who's going to develop those kind of technical tests, technical level tests? My developers may do a great job there, but they may not do a great job with exploratory testing. One thing about exploratory testing that I didn't bring up in Quadrant 3 is my take on exploratory testing. I love exploratory testing. It's great. Exploratory testing is great for finding gaps that we didn't think about in the user story. Exploratory testing takes a clear mind. It takes experience. Exploratory testing takes, I have so much experience doing exploratory testing, I could probably jump on something and do a decent job doing exploratory testing. But exploratory testing takes time. It takes some creativity. Exploratory testing is not the kind of thing that somebody can just throw garbage data at a function and get all their exploratory testing done, right? It's a bit more creative than that. That may be one technique I use, is throwing garbage data at a function. That's great. It might be a good start, but it's going to take some creativity. But exploratory testing to me is the best place that you find gaps in the user story, or gaps in the acceptance criteria, things that you didn't even realize might be a problem with this, how this story is going to be used. And to do good exploratory testing, you need knowledge of the user, knowledge of testing, knowledge of the platform. Okay, so I was talking about knowledge of the platform and then knowledge of testing. Who has those skills? Who has that knowledge? Who's going to wind up executing your test when you're looking at who's going to do Quadrant 3 type tests, who's going to do Quadrant 4 type tests, who's even going to do Quadrant 2 type tests? If I'm relying, we know we're going to rely on our devs for low-level unit tests. Who does testing past that? A big part of that depends on who has the skill set. Okay, so I was talking about who does what, where, brings us to this idea of what tests do developers run. One thing about this Agile and Scrum idea, modern development, CI/CD, DevOps, everybody tests. Everybody has a piece in quality. Everybody does some amount of testing. Devs test, QEs tests, PMs tests, PO, they test, users test, everybody tests. But who does test? Who does what test where? So what some teams do to get around this quadrant idea is they might have a separate Q3 team. And the Q3 team works more on the integrated product. They don't work on the like individual stories. They're working on more the individual product in more like a test environment, integrated testing environment, and they might be responsible for UI automation. I do know just as many teams that follow this idea of you build it, you own it. It is not a separate team that if I have a Scrum team and they write some function, they own that function. They own that function the whole way through a dev environment, a testing environment, a staging environment, and acceptance testing, user acceptance testing. that it's one team that does all of those tasks, which there's nothing wrong with that at all. There's nothing wrong with that at all, right? It's just a whole lot of testing that's going to have to happen um, by that individual Scrum team. In that case, where it's not a separate team and the Scrum team that owns that user story and owns that function is probably going to have a definition of done built around getting all the quadrant 1, quadrant 2, quadrant 3, quadrant 4 testing tasks completed before they can call a story done. If you do have a separate team that's doing quadrant 3, quadrant 4, they're probably going to be more responsible for the system testing, user acceptance testing, integration, depending on how you define integration, but end-to-end scenario, workflow, transaction, all these words, device, browser, and probably more responsible for test automation, at least from the UI perspective or through a UI, if it happening by a separate team. So remember that using these quadrants, it's all context driven, depending on your skill level. When I say skill level, what I mean by that is if I hire technical testers, they're going to approach this quadrant thing a certain way. If I hire bankers to test a banking app, they're going to approach this quadrant thing, or how they're used, how technical testers are used in the quadrant thing, and their piece in this quadrant thing is going to be different than how bankers are going to be used in this quadrant thing working on a banking app. And also this idea of how bugs escape, looking at what bugs escape, what bugs are found where, managing that inside these quadrants. The idea of who tests. When I say everybody tests today, that's a very broad statement by me. It's something I absolutely believe that everybody tests today. But when you're using these quadrants, who's going to run what tests where? And then the idea of exploratory testing. Do you want to wait till quadrant 3 to do exploratory testing? That's a bit late. Where do you find gaps in the user stories? I don't want to call a story done, only to have some quadrant 3 tests happen where they say you have a whole use case here that nobody even thought of and it doesn't work. We can't do that function in this alternative use case, or we don't have any errors built around if I'm using a certain piece of data or a certain type of data that customers often do. You guys validated the user story with a certain couple of pieces of data and it worked great, but the minute I use some problematic data, it doesn't work anymore. So where do you find those gaps? Who finds those gaps and who does that kind of testing? Remember, to say this, I want to point out this lean principle of amplified learning, right? Lean has these great principles, eliminating waste and just-in-time decisions and deliver as fast as possible, all those lean principles. One of the principles is amplified learning, and I look at bug finding as learning. When you're finding bugs, you're learning. How does it work under this condition? How does it work under that condition? How does it work on this device? Different than how it works on that device. I'm learning and finding bugs. Who does that bug finding? Who does that learning about how the system works, and where are we going to fit that into these quadrants? Exploratory testing is essential. Finding bugs is essential. So to summarize this whole discussion that we've been having, Agile testing is dynamic and it's uncharted, right? Nothing in the Agile Manifesto says this is how you test. Nothing in Scrum says this is how you write code or this is how you test. And it's also local, right? It's also context driven. Who tests in modern SDLC is changing. With developers taking on more testing responsibilities, are they really going to want to take on UI automation? How much UI automation are we doing? Things like transaction and workflow that involve other functions and other stories. Am I really going to ask my developers to do that, or am I going to have a separate test team to do that? So who tests in modern development is very different. Thinking about quality at every step and shift left, some of these cultural ideas, fail fast, you build it your own. These cultural ideas have a big impact on who tests when. Remember, testers and test teams do a whole lot more than just functional validation and UI automation, right? To check that acceptance criteria, if I'm going to search for that postal code, that zip code, sure, I can run that search and I can validate that function works if I have a valid postal code. But what about all those conditions that I ran through earlier? Testers do a whole lot more than check that an acceptance criteria is valid and then go and automate a happy path automation test about that. There's a whole lot more to testing. Hopefully you got that out of a lot of the descriptions I was talking about. If you choose this quadrant idea to implement in your Agile testing strategy or in your modern testing strategy, it's going to be unique to you. Who does what tests that are going to be unique to your product? I think I've talked about that context-driven part enough. It's going to be unique to you. This is not, the quadrants is not a cookie cutter. The technical service that a test team provides is really a bridge between low-level, isolated tests that developers might do at the unit level and having happy customers. That acceptance, user acceptance testing, there's a big leap between low-level unit tests and user acceptance tests. There's a big leap and big opportunities for failure. Test teams generally provide that technical service to the team, bridging the individual isolated low-level unit tests with user acceptance testing and the customer being happy. And where and how you fit automation into this is going to rely on you having a modern testing strategy. How much UI-driven tests? How much UI? How much unit testing? How much UI testing? How much service level testing? What tools you're using? How much mobile automation you're going to do? All of these things fit together into a test automation strategy that's going to be unique to your team. And I don't think we should use the little clouds on the edge of these quadrants for where and what you automate. That's going to be unique to you. So if this sounds like something that your team struggles with or you want help on it, you can give us a call and we'll set up a conversation on it with an expert from our team to help you find the best solution, the best testing strategy, the best test automation strategy, or staffing, or how you're going to manage these quadrants and really manage delivering the best product, getting these tasks done, whether you use these quadrants or not. I'd be happy to help you. So thank you. I'm glad you watched these hopefully 2 videos, and see you again.
Thank you for attending our Agile Quadrants webinar series. As a reminder, we will be sending out a recorded version of this webinar within 48 hours. If you attended Part 1 last week, you will have received a copy via email. If you missed last week's webinar, then please visit LogiGear.com to access Part 1. Thank you for your time. Goodbye.